Everyone, welcome to Barrington Public Library. My name is Shivani Egan. I'm the community engagement librarian here. I want to welcome you. Thank you so much for coming. How many people were here for our ghost presentation earlier this week? I thought I saw a couple of familiar faces. It's quite a spooky week for us, and I'm leading our BPL Mystery Society down the hall, so we're gonna have a lot of fun. So I'm so happy to welcome Charlotte Carrington-Farmer here to give this lecture, Beyond Salem, 1692. Charlotte's been here a few times before, and it's always a joy. She's so knowledgeable. This is her, specialty. So you're really in for a treat tonight. I'm going to turn things over to her. She can introduce herself a little bit more, but I do want to thank you for coming here. We did just put our November calendar out, so you can kind of see what we have going on in November. You can pick one up at any service desk. We have a lot of fun programs coming up, so we'd love to see you for those. But thank you for coming. Let's give Charlotte a warm welcome. Thank you.
All right, folks. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, wonderful. It's always a joy to come and talk in my adopted hometown of Barrington. As you can hear, well, two things. I'm slightly croaky, so apologies, but I hope that adds to the mystery and witchcraft bit. And secondly, I'm not originally from here, right? I'm originally from the UK, and my job at Roger Williams University is to teach early American history. So they hired a Brit to come and do that some 13 years ago. So I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about witchcraft in general in the late 16th and in the 17th century, and try to help us set that famous moment in 1692 when Salem has this massive outbreak of witchcraft, and that is really extraordinary for the time. So I'm going to talk about a couple of different things tonight as we go through. I'm going to plan to talk for maybe 45, 50 minutes and allow 5-10 minutes for questions at the end. So we're aiming to finish right around 7:30. So I also teach a class on witchcraft, right? So that's one of the great joys of being an early Americanist. At least once a year, I'll teach a class on witchcraft. And one of the things I ask my students to do is to draw what they think a witch looks like, right? And I've not done that activity because I'm terrible at drawing, but I did go a little bit wild on Google, and this tends to be, right, what you think about as a stereotypical witch. Maybe someone flying on a broom with a black cat, wearing black, kind of old looking. You see the pointy nose, the kind of pointy chin, there's long talon-like hands, and maybe, mixing some type of potion. So what I want to do with you tonight is to kind of pull apart that stereotype and see how true that was in the 17th century. Like, where do these stereotypes come from? And I want to talk to you about, what kinds of people were accused of witchcraft in the 17th century. What did witches actually do, right? Like, what did it mean if someone accused you of witchcraft? And then where and how did witches become witches? Like, how did they get their supernatural power? And then how did communities identify and detect witches? Like, what mechanisms were in place? And then once someone had been accused of witchcraft, how did different communities go through the different steps to remove the witches? And then we'll wrap up with the last 5 or 10 minutes doing a little bit about Salem specifically. So I want to start with that kind of first question about witchcraft. And I want you to think about two different sets of people in this period. Most everyday people like you and I, right, who are just going about our everyday business, are concerned about the first thing that you see on there. They're really concerned that if there's a witch in their community, they would probably know, because that witch would have done some harm to them, right? That they're concerned about how witches they believe were criminals who had supernatural ability, right? Who might come to their farm and stop their cow from, making milk. They might come and spoil their crops. They might send a storm to sea and, cause a ship to capsize. So they're concerned with the earthly things that witches can do with their supernatural ability. Now, that's the vast majority of people in the 17th century. The difference is the clergy and members of the educated elite. I mean, they're concerned with that, but they have a bigger concern that is at the forefront of their minds. They are absolutely terrified about the relationship between the witch and the devil, that the witches have signed this pact with the devil and they are part of this organization that is flipping Christianity on its head. So whilst most people are worried about the harm witches can do to them day to day, the clergy and educated elite have a slightly different concern. Now, at the heart of all witchcraft accusations in this period is this idea that you become a witch when you sign a pact with the devil, right? That's a moment that you go from potentially being possessed to becoming an instrument of Satan. So later on this evening, we're going to have a look at some primary sources, some images and some written documents, and you'll see references to signing the devil's book. Now, the devil might use a whole bunch of different ways to recruit you to sign his book. He might offer you riches. He might offer you a fancy house to live in. He might offer you a husband or a baby or whatever it might be. And if that didn't work, the devil might recruit you with darker means, potentially with torture and that kind of stuff. But that moment when someone signed their name in the devil's book, that's a moment they go from just potentially being possessed to being officially a witch. And so when we historians are reading the primary sources, we're always looking for that evidence that someone said, yeah, I've signed the devil's book, or I've seen so-and-so's name in the devil's book. And that's the point they become the instrument of the devil. And so one of the things that we have to be really careful about is, especially when we're looking at Salem, it starts off, as we'll learn later, with, a couple of young girls kind of getting possessed, right? Like they start to behave in a really weird way. They're not witches. They are under the possession of a witch. A witch is the person who has signed the devil's book. Does that make sense? Okay, and so we have, one of my favorite things about teaching about witchcraft is that we don't just have written sources, which are well and good. We have all these incredible woodcut images. And so the image you can see behind me, we can see this is the devil, right? This is a pretty classic early modern image of the devil. He's got his talon-y hands and feet, he's got his tail, his wings, his horns, and what's happening here is that they're swapping the good book, the Bible, for the devil's book. And so one of the things that witches were believed to do in the early modern period was they would have a kind of counter Sabbath, and one of the things they would do is sign their name in the book. And so what's really important to keep in our minds when we think about the broader context of witchcraft is witches were not supernatural beings, right? The devil, they believed, had subordinate demons that interacted with witches, but the witches themselves remained human. They were gifted, when they signed the devil's book, superhuman powers. And so what that means is, if you and I are just regular members of our community, if I had a dispute with some of my neighbors in the audience, right? So if I had a dispute with my neighbor, right? Let's say, I don't know, my dog got loose and caused a mess on your garden, and you came round to tell me about it, and I was like, oh my God, they're so annoying, and I muttered something under my breath, and then the next day something bad happened to my neighbor, that's pretty likely that, especially if I'm old and unmarried and a bit of a drain on society, those personal I'm not old, I'm not a drain on society. But those personal disputes are, for most of the time period, in most of the cases, at the heart of where those witchcraft accusations come. So we have these really wonderful primary sources that describe some of those everyday things that witches could do with their superhuman powers. So, not only could I don't know, if your dog was annoying my dog, I could bewitch your dog and make it behave weirdly. We have an example of a cow who, quote, had taken with strange fits, jumping up and knocking her head against the fence. So if your animal started to behave in a strange manner, and I say that as someone who's got a horse who is often behaving in a strange manner, that might lead you to think, oh, do you know what? Did I have conflict with someone? Is this potentially someone bewitching my horse? Witches were also believed to cause all kinds of damage, and in some of the cases, actually, it almost seems like some witches have a specialty, like like a major and a minor in different kinds of witchcraft. You know, whether that's causing storms at sea, damaging crops, stopping cows giving milk, causing your beer to spoil when you're brewing, and again, if you're interested in this in the Q&A, I can talk more. There's been a lot of work in recent years at looking at midwifery and witchcraft and how midwives are susceptible to accusations. And so much of that is because the stereotypical person who's accused of witchcraft is a woman who is not married, whether that's because she's widowed or whatnot, who's past the age of bearing children. And one of the things that the devil might offer for signing his book is a child. And so they're particularly vulnerable. And especially in this time period, there's a real belief in monster babies as well, that there's a really famous example from here with Anne Hutchinson and Mary Dyer that, you know, they give birth, they have a miscarriage, and they describe the child as a monster baby. So there's this real interest in women's bodies and birth. So, you know, how do witches perform their magic, right? Well, we have extensive descriptions of this. A witch, they believe, for most of this period, can simply do harm by looking at someone. So again, I want you to think about living in these close-knit communities where most people know that witches tend to target people they know. It's not that common for a witch to randomly target someone they don't know. And again, if you've had conflict in this tight-knit community and someone just looks at you a little bit funny, that means, again, people are constantly evaluating their interactions with their friends and neighbors, whether that's a look or even just a touch. Curses were seen to be a particularly powerful form of witchcraft. So again, when we dive into Salem, one of the first people to be accused, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, they had had a dispute with their neighbours. She muttered something under their breath and something happened. The same with the Pendle trials in England. There's a beggar, the woman mutters a curse, the beggar dies, and then that's seen as it is. So muttering things and looking at people in a strange way is particularly dangerous. Witches then have animal familiars. So you know how we started with that image with a witch with a black cat at her foot? That does have some evidence in the 17th century. So animal familiars were believed to be gifted to witches when they signed the devil's book, and they were their instruments. So a witch could send her animal familiar out to do bad deeds for her. And it was believed that the animal familiars had to come back to the witch at least once a day to suckle and to nurse. And so it leads to these really invasive bodily searches of women. So any kind of, you know, unusual lump or bump on your body could often be used as evidence. And the other thing that's really interesting is that I always make this joke with my students and they never laugh, but when we think about Harry Potter, and you know, J.K. Rowling actually had studied a lot of medieval witchcraft treatises, and you know, she writes when you become a Death Eater, you know, Voldemort gives you the dark mark. I mean, that's based in a lot of medieval witchcraft ideas that when you sign the devil's book, the devil would leave a mark on you. And so they're looking often for two different marks when they're searching women's bodies, whether that's for the animal familiar or whether that's a mark that the devil has left you. And I don't want to be too graphic, I don't know if you've had your dinner yet, but they're really invasive searches. They often believe that they're in the breast area and in, you know, private regions. And so it's really aggressive. So witches' animal familiars then, we think of the black cat as a stereotype, and there are some cases of witches being accused of having black cats, but there are so many other different animal familiars that I'll talk to you about tonight. So I put a couple of quotes up there. A little thing like a cat, something like a little dog. I've kept the 17th century spelling for you. Sometimes, as we'll see in Salem with Tituba, who's an enslaved Arawak woman who's one of the first three to be accused, her animal familiar is not an animal. It's a kind of hybrid human animal thing. So they can be almost imagined animals too. When a witch was going to do witchcraft, people also believed that she might use puppets or rag dolls. So she might make, a puppet of someone, and if she wanted them to feel pain in a particular spot, she might, target that on the puppet. We also know that puppets were used in counter magic too. We have evidence of them sometimes being buried in the walls of houses. So if a witch was trying to do harm to you and you were in your house, they believed quite widely that the puppet would feel the pain rather than you. And there's all these kind of counter magic stuff, like hanging a horseshoe outside your house to kind of ward off that evil. Witches were also believed to be able to, the term they use is see what was to come to pass. We would say they could tell fortunes. They had this uncanny ability to kind of predict what was going to happen. And so we see that quite often in the trials, that goody so-and-so somehow knew that a storm was going to come and, devastate the island. Witches could obviously summon evil spirits. And witches then, in addition to having animal familiars, had two other skills that were kind of extraordinary. One was that they could transform themselves into animals. And we see this play out really importantly in Salem. So I'm just having a quick drink. The term witchcraft scholars use for that is spectral evidence, right? Like, I saw a spectre of goody so-and-so. Like, she looked like a little brown dog. I'm like, what do you mean? Like, you're asleep in your bed and you saw a brown dog, but you knew it was somebody else? And so again, one of the questions I often get from students is like, what was going on, right? And especially if I've got students in my class who are science majors, they always come to me, they're like, oh, I've read about the ergot poisoning or whatever it might be. And we historians are like, yeah, that's fine, but you have to understand that this was a world of wonder, right? Where, it really did make sense that you were constantly looking out for signs that you were blessed from God or the devil was amongst your community. So witches could transform into animals too. They could also render themselves invisible. So we see in some of the trial testimonies, like, I sense that goody so-and-so was in the room. Oh, okay, great, So again, us modern day skeptics really question that. But in the 17th century, if you read enough official treaties on witchcraft and you knew the cases, that would make sense to you. And then the other kind of really famous ability that we tend to think about with witches is the ability to fly, right, often on a broom. And as we'll see, that did hold true in the 17th century. Witches were believed to have that ability to fly, whether if you were a man, you'd probably fly on a pitchfork. If you're a woman, you'd probably fly on a broom, quite gendered mechanisms there. Certainly in early modern Europe, there was a real purpose to the flying that I'll talk about a little bit later when we get to the witches' Sabbath. I just want to show you some cool animal familiars. I'll have a drink and I'll let you have eyes on this. Let me move to the side so you can see. So this source comes from 17th century England, when they appointed this guy, Matthew Hopkins, as his official job title was Witchfinder General, right? So his job was basically to identify and prosecute witches. And you can see him here. We can see then these depictions of witches. Look at this one. I mean, this is pretty stereotypical. Look at her pointy nose, her long hands. She looks kind of old. Some of the animal familiars that are named, this looks like a rabbit. This kind of looks like a dog, but this animal, I'm really not sure what it is. So again, like, as a historian, we are really lucky that we have so many written descriptions of what people saw as animal familiars of witches, but also these really cool woodcuts that we can kind of have a look at as well. And so that animal familiar, that stereotype that I started with an old-looking witch with a pointy nose, with a black cat around her feet, actually has some evidence in the 17th century primary sources. And that other kind of stereotype I started with, right, the witch and her broom, again, this comes from Cotton. This image is published multiple times, but the version I've got is from Cotton Mather. So again, we can see that stereotype of witches flying through the air on brooms is evidence. And so, again, look at that stereotype. She's got the pointy hat. I mean, those noses are excessively pointy, and that chin. And this woman who, presumably, these two witches, we've got a man coming down here along with the devil or one of his subordinate demons, coming to recruit this woman and take her away. So we see that actually those stereotypes are shown in evidence in the images of the primary source. And so what a lot of the primary sources tell us then, if we're looking for a stereotypical witch in this age of the witch hunt, right, in this long 17th century, most of the witches were women, right? And I'm really being cautious when I say most, because it does vary from place to place, especially in pockets of Europe. There are some places where overwhelmingly it's men accused, and it varies. There's a really great book that I'm going to recommend at the end called The Witch Hunt in Early Modern Europe by a historian called Brian Levac that's done incredible work on the geographic disparities on gender. But for our early modern English Atlantic, so England and New England, that holds true, that primarily it is women accused. Most of them are, I want to say elderly, but I feel like they class me as kind of old too. So most of them are past childbearing age is what I would say. Most of them are unmarried, whether that means they've never been married or they've been widowed. And most stereotypical people who are accused of witchcraft are on the margins of society some way. So whether that's they're appealing for financial aid from the town, maybe they've had a child out of wedlock, maybe, I don't know, something's happened to the family farm and they've fallen on hard times. So they're somehow on the periphery of society. Now, I put that, but that's not always true, right? That's always a caveat, right? So we have these, what we historians would call typical witch hunts, right? Where there's just one round of accusations, where there's interpersonal between neighbors, maybe a couple of people are accused, they may or may not get convicted. But we see these bigger witch hunts in now what is a modern day country of Germany, where they spiral and spiral and spiral, and then that secondary and tertiary round of accusations, all that tends to go out of the window, right? Everyone's on the table for accusations. And that's exactly what happened in Salem, right? The first 3 people accused in Salem, Tituba, an enslaved Arawak woman, nobody's surprised. Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, women on the margins, nobody's surprised. But in that second round of accusations, in that third round of accusations, all of that goes out of the window. The richest man in Salem is accused. A former minister is accused. So we see these stereotypes hold, but in those bigger witch hunts, it really does get challenged. So how do you find someone's a witch? Well, I already told you one way. They often hire committees of women, respectable women in the village or the town, to come and strip search women, looking for the devil's mark when they've signed the devil's book, or for the witch's teat, where they believe the animal familiar will come and suckle. But the surest sign that like witchcraft juries and witch hunters like Hopkins are looking for are self-condemnation. And that leads to one of the biggest questions around witchcraft is what happens if you torture someone and they confess, right? Like, how valid is that confession? And that really is what leads to a lot of differences around the early modern Atlantic world around the laws on torture. So, for example, in New England, we really don't see that typical that people are tortured. The example that is the exception is in Salem when Giles Corey is pressed to death. They're not just torturing him for fun, they're looking to get a confession. That's the holy grail. They're looking for people to confess to their witchcraft, not just for themselves, but so they can then tell you the other names they may have seen in the devil's book. Like, that's what they're also looking for, and for that information. And so we do see that, and what really changes changes. There's more witch hunts. If you're interested in witch hunting in Scotland, my good friend Michelle Brock has written several books that I highly recommend. And part of her work compares what goes on in Scotland versus England and the rest of the New England colonies. And the laws in Scotland around torture are really fascinating to compare to England. And when James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England, he publishes a book called Demonology on witch hunting. So we see England take this slightly different path at that point. So people are looking for confessions one way or the other. Now, let me give you a couple of primary sources. So Nicholas Remy writes extensively on witchcraft in early modern Europe, and I want to share some of his words with you this evening. He says, quote, "The devil's brands and seals, those whom he has newly claimed as his own, marking them especially on that part of the body which was anointed by the priest on their day of baptism. The place is entirely bloodless and insensitive, so that even if a needle be deeply thrust in, no pain is felt and not a drop of blood is shed. This fact is held to be so certain a proof of capital guilt that it's often made the base of examination and torture." So there's real debate amongst witch academics Remy about can witches feel pain, right? So that's one of the things that people, when they're talking about, is it right to torture someone to get a confession, if there is this belief that maybe witches don't feel pain. Now, my focus is mainly the 17th century, but I have to take you back into the 15th century to one of the kind of transformative treatises on witchcraft, the Malleus Maleficarum. This is one of it's not the first, but it's one that influences a lot of the 17th century ideas. And you see a lot of the pamphlets that I'm about to reference back to this one. So this is the book then, Demonology, first published in 1597 and again in 1603, that the King of Scotland, who then becomes the King of England, writes about. So just think about what I've just said. The King of Scotland, who becomes the King of England, publishes a book on identifying witches. So that transforms the nature of witch hunting in the British Atlantic world. If the King of England, who is also a massive conspiracy theorist, I always say to my students, I was if he was alive today, he'd be Elvis isn't dead, right? So he loves this. And this is irrelevant, but it's an interesting story. He's convinced that people are trying to plot after him and his family, and they're going to try and sink the ships and do bad things. And he's the one that they have the gunpowder plot against, right? Where in 1605, they try to blow him up in the Houses of Parliament. So they make someone who's a conspiracy theorist even worse because it actually comes true for him. So he publishes this book on witch hunting that, again, informs a lot of the legal process as we hit that 17th century mark. Now, I was here earlier on this year talking about a book I just wrote called Roger Williams and His World. And part of that book talks about Mary Williams, Roger's wife. And I wanted to just bring this in here because I think it's always good to talk about something that has a connection to Rhode Island. So Rhode Island in the period that we're dealing with doesn't have witchcraft accusations in the way that neighboring colonies such as Connecticut and Massachusetts do. But I wanted to give you a Rhode Island flavor. So Mary Williams, Roger Williams' wife, who played a really important role in the founding of Rhode Island. And I say this because Sir John Brown House has just opened an exhibit just a few days ago on Mary Williams and the founding of Rhode Island that you should all go and check out. That's a plug for the exhibit. When she grew up in England, she grew up about 15, 20 minutes away from where I'm from in Nottinghamshire, in Worksop. And she grew up in the household of Richard Bernard. So her maiden name was Bernard. And her father then was the vicar of Worksop Priory, but he lost his job actually several times for challenging the church authorities. And he writes several books. He's really, really well published. But he publishes this book, A Guide to Grand Jurymen. In the 17th century, U's and V's are interchangeable, I's and J's, we get long S's. So I've included this up. But can you see here that the second part that the book is a whole treatise on witchcraft? So Mary grew up in a household where her father knew about all the witchcraft cases. She, as a kid in this area of Nottinghamshire in the East Midlands, like right in the middle, would have known about. Like, her father is called to an exorcism. And so in this book that Mary's dad writes, it's 266 pages. And so the first part of the book is basically Mary's father, Richard, basically helping members of the grand jury, like, figure out if someone presents natural symptoms and physical conditions, and then decide whether that is just, oh, someone's sick or whatever, something's gone wrong, or is that possession? So that flags something to me that, again, the historian Brian Levac has done a really good job, is there were skeptics of witchcraft throughout the period we're dealing, right? Most people believe in it, but there are skeptics. So not every accusation of witchcraft led to a trial. And so he talks about the difference between natural and supernatural possession. But the second part of the book is a really incredible primary source describing all the things that I'm sharing with you tonight. He's got a whole section on the nature of witchcraft. He's got a really big section on the pact with the devil. He's got a really cool descriptions of animal familiars, the devil's mark that I've described. He's got a whole chapter on like all the bad maleficent deeds that witches do. And so he's a really incredible primary source for historians who work on witchcraft, and that's Mary Williams' father. He also describes some of the famous episodes in witch hunting, specifically the Pendle trials of 1612. So this is I'll just move over so you can see. He talks about, what sorts of people are most apt to be seduced and to be made witches. How these do prepare themselves for Satan when he enticeth to witchcraft. That Satan showeth himself commonly. And so this is just like the contents page. These are all the things that he talks about in depth. And you can see over here then that he has all these, so this is just a screenshot inside there, that he's talking here about like the animal familiars. He says, beside this sucking, they leave marks upon them, sometimes like a blue spot, as it was on Alison Device. And so again, this is from the Pendle trials. So he's describing all of the marks on there. And again, this is a reference to Pendle 2 with Dempdike and Chattox. So he's really knowledgeable about witchcraft. You can see here then, again, he's talking about Chattox and the Lancashire witches, all the people involved. He's talking about how witches do their magic with charms and spells. They've got like prayers they do. And so by cursing, right, and banning. So he is a really great primary source on all the things that I opened with tonight. Again, the other thing that I want you to know as a historian is like, not just what do we know, like how do we know it, right? I feel like as historians, you shouldn't just believe me. That's why I want to show you as many primary sources as possible. And as I said to you, we have some really great visuals too. So this is a slightly earlier source, but I think it's really worth showing. So I'll give you a second to have a look at this while I have a drink. Can you see this if I'm stood here? Okay. So what's going on in this source is, maybe you didn't recognize him, maybe he'll seduce you. This is a devil, but he's literally the devil in disguise. You can see he's like wearing like clothes, he's got a hat on and he's closed here, but we know it's the devil because his tail and his talons, and look at his hands and his kind of creepy looking face. He's seducing this youngish woman by trying to offer her this beautiful castle in exchange for signing his book. So the devil would often come in soft and be like, hey, come and marry me and come to this castle and have this wonderful life. And then if that doesn't work, he might turn the torture on. So again, I'll give you a second to have a look at this and then I'll talk you through it. So this source is really useful for a couple of reasons. Firstly, that we can see some of the like less easy to identify animal familiars that are being gifted to these women who have presumably just signed the devil's book. It's a really cool primary source in that we see the devil, right, all black. He's got his horns, he's got his wings, his tail, his talons, and we can see these 4 women pretty much like standard stereotypical, right? They're all old, they've got that pointy nose, that pointy chin, and they've got these little babies, right? So historians have spent quite a bit of time debating this image about which way the baby is going, right? Is this the devil saying, hey, sign my book and you're going to get these babies as a gift? Yeah, some historians think that. Other historians are thinking it's the other way around, that the women are offering these babies as a gift. And so we have other primary sources that talk extensively about how at the Sabbath, when witches get together, they do all kinds of really bad things, right? And one of the things is that they eat children, right? They sacrifice children. And so is that what's going on in this primary source? And I guess I'm going to talk a bit more about that later. So again, I'll give you a second to have a look at this and then I'll talk through. All right, so there's a belief in parts of early modern Europe that witches do get together and have a Sabbath, right? Like it's literally the reverse of, it's a reverse of the Christian Sabbath. And one of the things that they do, if they're not eating children, is they make merry, right? They have music and they have dancing. They're in a circle dancing on the Sabbath with some of the devil's subordinate demons, his incubi and his succubi. But the other thing they might do at the Sabbath, I guess I would say this is a trigger warning, but I hope it is. They do this. They feast on children. So again, going back to that other image, it's not a good place to be if you're a Christian on the witches' Sabbath. The other thing that happens on the Sabbath is the devil literally baptizes you. Here you can see the devil baptizing this man and all these people queuing up to get baptized. So it is really a counter to Christian practice. And then the other thing you might do at the witches' Sabbath is, I don't think you can get any more symbolic, right? Like literally stamping on the cross. So remember how I started off this evening talking about the dual threat of witchcraft? And I said the clergy and the educated elite are really concerned about the pact with the devil and how it's part of this organized sect to literally destroy Christianity. These woodcuts bear true to that, right? Shows you. I wrote this PowerPoint several times today, and in one version, I took the next slide out and then I just put it back in because I thought you should see it. So the other thing that people do at the Sabbath is this. I'll let you have a look. Yeah, they're literally kissing the devil on his bottom. I figured you could all take it. And I put this in there because, again, in the witches' Sabbath, it's not just you're stomping on the cross and you've signed your name in the book and you've renounced the Bible, but they believe that it shows your utter debasement to the devil if you're willing to kiss him in that particular spot. So again, I feel like it's one thing to read these written primary sources, but it's another to see the visuals. All right, for the next 5-10 minutes, I'll talk about Salem specifically. I'll give you some recommendations for reading and I'll take some questions. So I want to spend, the next 5-10 minutes talking about Salem. The first thing that I want to kind of be really clear about is when we say Salem in the 17th century, specifically in 1692, we have to be a little bit more detailed. So when we say Salem today, we think of the town, right, where it's kind of a bit crazy right now with all the tourists. But in the 17th century at 1692, that was called Salem Town. So modern day Danvers, Massachusetts was known as Salem Village. And it's actually in Salem Village that the first 3 accusations and the possessions of the young girls start. So I think you just need to keep that in mind. And I just want to give you a bit of context, actually, statistics about this. So I want to make the point to you that Salem is the exception, not the rule, in 17th century witch hunting. So between 1630 and 1692, there were around 103 witchcraft cases brought to court across the region. So 1630 is a really important year in Massachusetts Bay. It's the year that Boston is founded. It's when John Winthrop comes over on the Arbella. He gives that famous speech, the model of Christian charity, that the colony is going to be a city upon a hill, an example to the rest of the world. And that period from 1630 to 1645 is what historians call the Great Migration, where thousands of settlers come. So in that whole period, we have 103 cases brought to court. And then from that, 40 people are formally accused before 1692. And of that number, 12 are executed. So I want you to think about this really carefully. I think sometimes in popular depictions, it's almost as though someone calls you a witch and then you're dead, right? Like, that's not the case. There are really careful legal mechanisms in place, right? You have to have all kinds of evidence. You have to have multiple neighbors testifying. And most of the time that people are formally accused or executed, there's been several different accusations. And so it's not automatically a death sentence if someone calls you a witch. We actually see in some of the court records, if someone's accused of witchcraft, they sue for defamation and they countersue. So we do see some of those as well. So Salem then, those numbers just go wild. So across the period when the witch hunt runs for just around a year, 185 people are formally accused in Salem. So look at that number and all of those decades before that year. Again, it's interesting to look at the gender breakdown. 141 women and 44 men. So like almost clearly 3/4 are women. Now, that might make you think, oh, it's overwhelmingly women. Yeah, it is. But having 1/4 of the people be men is actually significant, right? And so remember what I was saying earlier about typical witch hunts tend to be just one round of accusations. Those men are in that second and third round of accusations, and that's where that number really spikes. So that's actually a lot of men compared to other witch hunts. So of that number then, 52 women and 7 men were put on trial. So you can see, even in Salem, in this extraordinary witch hunt, even if you were accused, it didn't necessarily mean that you were put on trial. And again, the numbers go down again. 26 women and 5 men were convicted. So even in Salem, where the evidence used is just really not as robust as in other trials, it didn't necessarily mean that people were convicted. And even from those convictions, we see 14 women and 5 men were put to death, and the last in September. Now, Salem is extraordinary, not just in the numbers of accusations, not just in the types of people that are accused. It's extraordinary in the court that is set up. So they set up a special court called the Court of Oye and Termine to basically hear these cases. And they also allow spectral evidence to be considered, i.e. like I saw a vision of so-and-so, in a way that it just hadn't typically been covered in other cases. So that's also adding to the accusations as well. I always recommend this book for people who are interested. It's not about Salem. It's called Escaping Salem, the Other Witch Hunt of 1692. And it tells a story of a much more typical witch hunt that nobody really knows about, a witch hunt that takes place in Connecticut in that year. And so Richard Godber is one of the leading historians on witchcraft in early New England. He's written books on Salem too, but this is a really great book to give you a counter story to Salem about what is much more typical. So Salem starts in the winter of 1691 to 1692. Now, I say that because the 17th century is weird, right? Like, you saw some of those written documents with U's and V's being interchangeable, S's and F's, I's and J's. You saw some of my quotes as though I couldn't spell little, right, or dog or whatever. There's no standardization of spelling in the 17th century. And so what that can mean is even in official court transcripts, things are spelled multiple different ways as the recorder is hearing them. And I mean, that's awesome for historians because there's been some great work on OP, original pronunciation, of like how did people sound with different dialects in the 17th century. And that's where living history museums such as Plymouth Patuxent museums can really tap into what did people sound like what did Mary Bernard sound like as she was growing up in Nottinghamshire. And the other thing to be mindful of, in addition to the spellings and stuff like that, is for our period in the 17th century, the new year starts in March. So like that means is when you see written documents like this, so this is Tituba's trial transcript, the handwriting's also weird as well, but you can see then Tituba, Tittuba, and can you see the date? It says March the 1st, 1690, 1/2. So what that means is like that's led to a whole bunch of people who aren't trained in 17th century paleography reading the handwriting being like getting the year wrong. And so anytime you're handling a document within the first 3 months of the year, you have to know that actually like that's 1692. And on some of the documents they'll just say March 1691 and you're like, is it 60? Like, so you have to be really mindful with that chronology too. So anyway, I digress. So in that winter, in modern day Danvers, which is Salem village in 1692, a couple of girls, Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, start to have fits. Now, they are the daughter and niece of one of the most important men in the village, the Reverend Samuel Parris. Now, Parris is a fascinating character, and if you go to Salem and go to the visitor center and watch the film in the visitor center, one of the arguments that they make in that film is like Samuel Parris is central to the witch trials, right? They talk about how he'd spent time in Barbados and he was a failure, and when he took over the ministry of the Salem Village Church, it was kind of like last chance saloon, and he got into conflict with his congregation, and the girls in his household, his niece and his daughter, had picked up on this, right? So I think the household where these kids have fits is important in and of itself. And it's really important to also say that when these kids start having fits, I don't know if they read Mary Williams' dad, Richard Barnard's book, but he talks about in that first book about natural causes versus supernatural. And they bring in William Griggs, a physician, to kind of have a look at these girls to see if there's a natural explanation. They think, no, it's not. But they do. And one of the things that's really fascinating is that even in the household of the minister in the village, he's got a relative called Mary Sibley who bakes a urine cake, right? So basically, I know it's great. And I've not got the primary source, but I should have included it. Basically, they get the urine of one of the girls who's been possessed and afflicted, and they mix it with all kinds of stuff. And they feed it to the dog, and the idea is that the dog will go back to the witch and reveal it. I mean, so like there's counter magic even in the most Puritan of Puritan households going on. Samuel Parris is not approving of this. So anyway, the initial accusations, nobody's surprised, right? They go after the stereotypical witches, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, margins of society. One of them's old, they've had conflict with neighbors, nobody's surprised. The other person they accuse is the enslaved Arawak woman who is living in the Parris household. So Tituba then, when Samuel Parris had spent time in Barbados, had come from Barbados with Samuel Parris. And there's a book I'll recommend at the end. It's a new book, well, it's not that new, but it's newish, by the historian Elaine Breslau, and it's all about Tituba. And she's done some incredible archival work, tracing her from her indigenous Arawak homelands in South America, how she was trafficked to Barbados, and then from Barbados came to New England. And so she's accused. And again, that's not that surprising, really. But there's no evidence up until this point that she was known as a cunning woman, right? Like there's no evidence up until that point. So Good and Osborne in their trial transcripts say they're innocent. Tituba, I want to spend a couple of minutes just wrapping up with this. So Tituba then is Arawak. Anytime you see her described as African or anything like that, there's really no evidence at all. There are African people accused in the trials. There's a woman called Candy, and she is described as being black, right? Tituba, if she was anything other than indigenous, which she would have been described as. So we know that she's native. And what's really cool is when we read Tituba's trial transcript, the work of Elaine Breslau has looked at how her confession blends English ideas of witchcraft, which she presumably heard enslaved with the minister Samuel Parris, but also blends African ideas of witchcraft that presumably she knew from her time in Barbados, along with her own indigenous Arawak ideas. And Elaine Breslau makes this really persuasive argument. I encourage you to check out her book, that she says that it's Tituba who convinces the authorities that the devil has actually invaded their society, this enslaved Arawak woman. She is the one who implicates community members outside of Salem. She's the one who says you need to stop looking at the typical people like Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, and she suggests that there's men involved. She's suggesting that there's elite. And she is the one that, had her confession not taken the way it did, maybe that we would just see the type of witch hunt that happens in Connecticut that same year, right? She is the one that launches this with the legal evidence. This is my last slide, and then I've got some pictures and an announcement. So in her original plea, she starts off saying, "I am innocent." And then kind of afterwards, she starts to change her story, and historians have speculated as to whether maybe her enslaver had forced her, tortured her. Really, we really don't know. We don't have her perspective. And then she kind of almost reluctantly admits to pinching the girls and threatening them. She describes her animal familiar as thus, right? I get my students to draw this creature, but I want you to visualize it. What is this? A thing all over hairy, all the face hairy and a long nose. I don't know how to tell how the face looks. With 2 legs, it goes upright, and it's about 2 or 3 feet high. What I will tell you is that's not a black cat, right? Like, that's not your stereotype. But again, Elaine Breslau has done some really great work on like that, and she mentions a bird, and she really does tie this to her multicultural background. She describes in her in her trial transcripts that there's flying going on. She says sometimes all 3 rode on a stick or a pole. And then she describes in detail about the devil. The devil had said to her, "Serve me, always serve me." And I can imagine in the courtroom that people like, I don't know, I don't want to say they fainted, but I can imagine it was a dramatic reaction when she said this. She'd seen the Devil's Book, and it wasn't just her and Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. There were 9 other marks in the Devil's Book. They've only got 3 people accused at this point. So now they're thinking, presumably, who are these other 9 people? And she talks about the evil one, a man, leading them in Boston. So they're not just in this small community now in Salem Village, they're now looking at how do they identify these people? So she launches the witch hunt in this incredible way and takes the heat off her. I mean, she does eventually survive the trials, her and her husband, John. We don't know what happens to them after they're released, but she survives. And so like we see these like really terrible depictions of Tituba. This is from several years ago at the Witch Museum, and really a more accurate prediction of Tituba. This is not her, but this is an indigenous woman who's Arawak from around that time. And I want to just end with a little bit of like tourism stuff. So when I teach my witchcraft class, the first place we go is modern day Danvers, right? We do eventually go to Salem, but we go to Danvers, and you can Google map this. It's I don't know, if you type into Google Samuel Parris House, Danvers, you have to kind of go behind someone's house. There is a path, but it looks a bit dodgy. And so these are the foundations of the Parris house. This is where those initial accusations would have taken place. But there's the sign that says this, right? I've not been for a few years, but I pray that this sign comes down because it's wrong. It says, "It was in this house in 1692 that Tituba, Reverend Parris's slave, told the girls of the household stories of witchcraft, which nurtured the village witchcraft hysteria." and resulted in the deaths. That's not true. There's no evidence that she nursed this hysteria, right? There's no evidence in the sources, and I feel reasonably confident they would have said she's a cunning woman, we know about this, right? So again, we have to be careful when we see these signs. So if you're looking for more information, this is Elaine Breslau's book, Witches of the Atlantic World. This is a book I use for my class. This is her work on Tituba. Here's a couple of books on Salem. This one is really cool, Salem Possessed. The historians Boyer and Nissenbaum look at the divisions between the village and the town and personal disputes and the socio-economic conflict. Mary Beth Norton's book, In the Devil's Snare, offers a different interpretation. She traces the recent wars with native peoples and looks at the people who've been held. This is like spoiler alert for historiography, but like she makes the argument that it's kind of PTSD from wars with native peoples and this sense of God's due that pushes it. And Carol Carlson's book, The Devil in the Shape of the Woman, really pushes that gender argument. So there's some great things. Now, I just want to give a shout out to my friend Hannah. Do you want to give a wave? So Hannah is a PhD student and she's writing her thesis right now. And so if you come to my talk, I figure you might be interested in her work. Hannah's working, as it shows on here, on Halloween festivals and public memory. And she's specifically interested in people who visit Salem in October and also Pendle in Lancashire in England. So if you've done either of those, please talk to Hannah at the end, scan the QR code. She's doing incredible work, not just as a historian, but thinking about historical memory and public history too. So please do talk to Hannah. All right, so I talked for longer than I thought, my apologies. We'll take a few minutes for questions. If anyone needs to leave imminently at 7:30, I will not be offended, but I'm happy to spend 5-10 minutes taking questions. Thanks for listening. All right, yeah, what's your question?